I'm good. All right, let's go. All right, I apologize if anybody is actually watching like Klaus, and we're going to start this. We're talking about the residential sale contract today, and that will be primarily our focus. We won't get into any other addendums or anything that go with this. We'll just talk about the contract. So make sure, first of all, that you're using RES-2000. That residential sale contract, and if you've been listening to our conversation, I referred to it as coming out in 19. Actually, I think this final version is RES 2000. So that's the one you should be using if you're writing a contract. If you look at the very first line of this contract, the contract has legal consequences. We're really talking primarily to the parties to the contract. And it says clearly, if you don't understand it, to consult your attorney. Part of our job as agents then is to make sure that the clients understand the contract. You're not an attorney, so don't get into attorney descriptions when you're doing this, but you do be able to break down each section of the contract and explain the general purposes. So we start with the contract, and for years, a lot of it's been around for a long time, we had seller and buyer in the contract at the first line. We don't have that anymore. Now we just have the buyer. The attorney's opinion is that we're selling a real property, and that the key is the buyer's name, who owns that real property. And then on section 1 on the property, seller agrees to sell and buyer agrees to buy, and you have to make sure that you get the correct address. I'll stress to you, if it's FHA, VA, or any government type of loan, make sure to get the right either street, avenue, court, circle on there, because that will kick it back out if they do a search prior to the closing, and it might delay your closing. So make sure you get that correct. And then of course the zip code and the county, and the county is important. This is one that gets left off, and we have to go back in a lot of times in compliance and get that put back in, but make sure you get that correct. On line 8, we're not typically doing a legal description on these properties anymore. We used to, and we just don't do it anymore. We'll put that onus on the title companies to come up with the correct legal description. And again, the attorneys are guiding us on that they'll take care of that in the deed. Now, however, if you're selling a meets and bounds type of property, say 5 acres, 10 acres, and it's got a meets and bounds description, I'd encourage you to check the box, make it a part of the contract, have your client's initial or sign, and have the seller initial and sign, or the buyer initial and sign when you do sell the property. The inclusion and exclusions in part 2 of this contract, property includes but it's not limited to all of the following, if any, which are now located on the real estate, all of which seller warrants to convey to buyer free and clear at closing. This contract, these 8 pages, and not a seller's disclosure statement, not the MLS, not an MLS detail sheet, or other promotional materials, such as marketing material, provides for what is included in the sale. And this has been a change for everybody over the last few years. If somebody wants something to be included in the transaction, they definitely have to write that in, and it gives you a place to do that. And it covers such issues as garage door openers and controls, exterior lighting, fences, including hardwired PET systems, which we see that occasionally. The key there is to make sure your client leaves the collars and controls if they're available. If they're not, then you need to make that clear to the buyer that they're not going to be left. Electrical lighting and TV related items, lighting fixtures, attached antennas, and TV mounts. We used to have the problem where people would take the mounts off the wall and leave big holes. Now the mounts stay unless that's written into a contract. Flush mounted speakers, fire, smoke, and CO alarms. And this includes these wireless systems that are being used now, Nest and so on, that are being used. You have to make sure that your seller is leaving those, and if they're not leaving those, they have to replace them with something. Because if a buyer client walks through and sees that Nest or thermostat, pardon me, and thinks it's coming with the house, and then they show up at closing or the walkthrough, and you've got a $35 thermostat sitting there, you may have some challenges. So both parties, both the listing agent and the buyer's agent, need to make sure that's corrected. On systems and utilities, propane tanks is a big problem for everybody. So if you see a propane tank and you're listing a property, your first question is for your seller is, do you own or lease the tank? If you own the tank, you can shop for propane anywhere. If you lease the tank, you typically have to buy the propane from whoever you lease the tank from. And there is typically an annual fee. So that's an item that needs to be addressed always. Again, you see there on, I guess it's line, not still in that same section, but on hardwired security and alarm systems, they will stay. Water softeners, sump pumps, fireplace equipment indoors, and trust me, I've seen these taken off of fireplaces. Kitchen cooking related. Notice that microwave ovens have to be built in. That doesn't mean if they're sitting on a counter or they slide into a hole that they're built in. So you have to make sure on that. Ovens, ranges, stoves, and attachments. So notice they don't say anything in here on kitchen or cooking related about refrigerators. If your buyer client wants the refrigerator, then the buyer client needs to direct that. Of course, you probably ask the question, and you need to be specific. So the stainless steel Amana refrigerator currently in the kitchen to remain with the property at no value. The at no value is added so that the lender can say, I'll still loan on this. We used to have to take those out of the contracts, and there was questions as whether that was fraud or not if they remain. So you need to address that. So to avoid misunderstanding, then in this list below, as included or excluded, any items that may be subject to question, which include on line 17, non-affixed equipment or other personal property, such as refrigerators, TVs, electronics, washer, dryer, and appliances. So if your buyer client wants a washer and dryer on the sale contract, then you need to write those in. One of the things I didn't mention really was mirrors. So mirrors in bathrooms over the last few years, because of HGT and every other things, have been set in the bathroom on the back of a vanity, these big, beautiful mirrors. Well, according to this contract, they remain with the house unless it's excluded. So if you do a walkthrough and the mirrors aren't there, then you need to make a call to the listing agent immediately. And then I would also mention here that if there is a storage building in the backyard or a play set, that you might need to address that. If you want the storage building, then you could put in there that storage building currently in the backyard to remain with the property, or the play set to remain with the property. But if you don't want those, and there's sometimes when you don't want a storage building because of its condition, or you just don't want the storage building, then you need to exclude those and direct the client to remove those prior to closing. Okay, in line 21, we go into the purchase price, the earnest money. The purchase price is pretty straightforward. We used to ask for write this as a check amount, and there were a lot of errors because of that. It's gone away now. And then on line 23, the seller concessions, if any, to be credited by seller at closing, see paragraph 10, are zero if nothing stated. Now, it's not unusual for government loans and some conventional loans for the buyer to ask for closing costs or concessions. Here's the deal. There's a whole list on this paragraph 10 of the concessions back on page 6 or 7. However, this is totally directed by the lender. The lender will have the final say on that. Chris and I are closing a contract on Friday. The closing costs written into concessions, or the concessions are written into the contract, was $3,000. The lender decided that only $1,800 could be taken out of those concessions. So the final determination is the lender's, not anybody else's. And then earnest money either has been provided, and there will be receipt and acknowledgement on the last page of the contract, or shall be delivered by buyer to the escrow agent no later than 10 days. Here's the issue. Not that many people run around with a checkbook anymore. And so you're writing a contract and they say they want to put down earnest money. A lot of times they'll have to deliver it. If that's the case, if they're going to deliver it and you check that box, and it's part of your job as an agent then is to ensure that check makes it to the title company. And people get busy, and maybe they're quarantined at home or something, and they forget about these things, but you've got to get that contract in there, or that earnest money check, pardon me. Let's see. Now, question almost always is, how much earnest money? I will tell you this. When I first got in the business, you'd see as much as 10% earnest money on a contract. And over the years, that's dwindled. We still see it on higher end purchases, but many contracts now have zero in that earnest money blank. And if your client wants that, if you're the seller's client, then you might have to counter back the contract to get that. But it doesn't change the value of the contract by not having earnest money. So don't be afraid if you get that and you see zero in there. You just have to explain to your seller that the situation is now that it's not as common. Then on 27, this is the first place you're identifying the title company. So all earnest money shall be delivered to. If there's no earnest money there, then you don't have to put anything in the blank. It goes on to say if there's going to be additional earnest money at some point, or earnest money is to be treated as non-refundable, attach a rider. So there's a rider in the Missouri forms for everything. So if that does happen, and this occasionally happens if you have to extend a contract, or if you're doing new construction and you make changes to the contract, you may have to have additional earnest money. And trust me, sometimes builders want it to be non-refundable. On number 4, on the closing, subject to the terms of this contract, this sale will be closed. And it's important to know that that means the unconditional release and exchange of the deed for the purchase price, together with all other documents and funds required by this contract. That's what the closing is. So you really don't have a closing until the funds are exchanged. And if you've been in the business for a while, you've gone in and signed as a seller, and you've signed as a buyer, but the funds aren't there yet. I don't think I'd be exchanging keys until the funds arrive and the title company says it's okay. Here we will put the name of the title company or the escrow company that's going to be used. It's expanded this part of the contract because they want to know the specific location for this closing. As a veteran in the industry, I don't care where you close as your broker. You can close anywhere you want to. You can close out of convenience, or you can close because of the skill of the people there. But if you're new to the business, then probably you're going to have to find out over time who does the best job. The key is to make sure you get it there. So for example, if it was Titan Title and Closing, that's what you'd put as closing agent at 2925 East Battlefield, Springfield, on month, day. So how many days do you allow for closing? This is where, if you are the agent writing the offer, hopefully you've been in contact with their lender, and the lender tells you we can close in X using this type of loan. So typically, we've been running pretty fast here, and the lenders have too, and they've been able to close a lot of properties in 30 days. However, that's a question to ask. It may not be as quick right now. It could be 45 days. So you have to make sure that you get that in there. Also, when you're setting that date up, try not to set it on a holiday or a Sunday, because you probably won't be closing on a holiday or a Sunday. This date, per the attorneys again, is always an on or before date. So if you were to close before that, that's okay. I would still suggest you get that in writing in a contract amendment. If you're going to close past this date for any reason, you must have an amendment, because the contract dies of its own language if you don't close on the day that you have in that blank. On 38, it talks about possession, and all keys will be delivered to the buyer at closing. It's amazing now how many houses we list that they can't find the keys. If you do have to have it create a key, then you need to get company 417 rekey or somebody of that nature to rekey the property and get proper keys for it. They should be exchanged at closing. And it says brokers are not responsible for delivery of keys, and buyers should change locks following possession. We sold a house recently for my mother-in-law, And we didn't know how many keys were out there. So the first thing we did when we listed the property was to go in and have the locks all rekeyed. So we knew that there was only one set of keys out there for the buyers. On 42 through 45, unless specified otherwise, the seller warrants that the property will be vacant as the time of closing, except for tenants, and that's a whole different situation. You won't run into that often. And in its present condition, together with any improvements or repairs required by the contract. Ordinary wear and tear accepted, and free of any debris or personal property not included above. So it used to say broom clean, and I kind of like that term, but no personal property should be in the house at closing in the property. And this goes as far as the attic too, for the Christmas tree they left up there. You need to make sure those things are out of there. If you're doing a walkthrough as a buyer, then you probably want to make sure if you walk through and they've got the garage is still full of personal property, then you need to get on the phone to the listing agent immediately and say, hey, we've got a problem. Here's the problem. Let's try to get it solved. On page 2, we go into the first part of the financing, the appraisal and financing. You can ignore the first paragraph if you want to. I usually do. I'm sure there are different types of appraisals, but we're not concerned about that. The lender typically orders the appraisal, and in most cases, we're going to be doing a residential appraisal. But trust me, a farm appraisal is different than a residential, and a commercial appraisal is different than a residential. So keep that in mind. The dates may change if you're dealing with different properties. I encourage you to always check line 50 box, that paragraph A, 5A, and then what this allows is for, even if it's an investment property, it allows, if the bank requires an appraisal, that you have the appraisal done, and if the appraisal comes in lower than contract value, then you can negotiate. Actually, the buyer can cancel the contract if the appraisal comes in lower, but typically you want to try to negotiate that if you can. The key to this is, though, that in line 54, that you put in there the term of the contract. So if you've got a 45-day closing, then you need to put 45 days in there, because we know that lenders are notoriously slow on the appraisal side, and you want to make sure that when the appraisal comes in, if it is lower than contract value, you have an opportunity to discuss that with your buyer. And there are options there. So if the appraisal comes in low, the buyer can cancel the contract, especially on any government loan if they want to. Now, the seller can agree to come down to the new appraised value if it's lower than the contract value. Or the buyer and seller can agree that they're going to split the difference. Or the buyer can, just ignore the appraisal and pay the difference. Typically what happens is that in most cases, the seller would have to come down to make the contract work. I had a question about appraisals the other day. If we get a bad appraisal and appraisal doesn't agree with contract value, can we just go back to the appraiser and get that corrected? I have never seen an appraiser make an adjustment more than 5%. So if it's lower than 5%, your options might be just to get a new appraisal. And again, you'd have to talk to the lender about that, whether they would accept one or not, even if the seller paid for it. On 61, 62, and 63, all regarding financing. So if I personally buy a property and I'm going to rehab that property and try to sell it, I would probably mark box B, which says it's not contingent upon financing, but if I want to, I could get some financing. Or C, non-conventional, and these are all the government loans. This is as high as 50% of the transactions that we have around the market area, especially in the rural areas. So this is what you're going to check most of the time, and you will have a government loan rider that you will attach as a part of the contract. And then D is conventional. A conventional loan is typically 95% or less. So the seller is, or the buyer is putting down 5% on the loan. Now again on this, all of these are kind of grouped together, but then D goes into great detail as to buyer agrees to do all things reasonably necessary, including but not limited to completing a loan application, paying for a credit report, appraisal, and any other required fees. Well, that looks like it only applies to D, but it applies to everything else when you're getting a loan. Again, on 67, line 67, this is where I would put the loan contingency deadline. The date that the lender says I can actually get the money should be the term of the contract again. Because if you've been in the business very long, you'll know that occasionally 5 days before closing, the lender says, oh my gosh, something's changed, credit score's off, you can't get a loan. So I'm going to put 45 days on this transaction if that's what the length of the closing is. And that's to protect the buyer, because if you look down at line 78, if the loan contingency deadline passes without a termination, the buyer remains obligated under this contract and must have available all funds required to close. A loan commitment or pre-approval does not guarantee that buyer's loan will actually fund. In other words, the buyer is still responsible. Even if it's a VA loan, he's getting 100%, or an FHA loan, he's getting 96.5%. He's responsible, and so he could be in default if you let that loan contingency deadline pass and then he fails to get funded. On line 74, 75, 76, typically what you're going to put in here is the type of loan that it is, or the amount of money they're going to borrow. If it's an FHA loan, that's 96.5. Typically the term is going to be 30 years, and typically the rate type is going to be fixed. In recessions and bad economic times, you'll see more adjustable loans, but we don't see very many now. Now in 75, the initial interest rate not to exceed. If you're dealing with first-time home buyers, sometimes if they've been quoted a 3.5 interest rate, you need to talk to the lender and say, okay, when do they not qualify? At what interest rate? And if he tells you 4.25, then that's what you need to put in there as a cap. And that protects them and allows them to get out of the contract if the interest rates were to climb. All right, on number 6, paragraph 6, on the title and survey, note any seller paid title fees set forth below are in addition to seller concessions. So the title fees that the seller pays are not included in those concessions that he's providing for on the first page. Excuse me. All right, so the seller shall transfer marketable title. This is important because if there are liens or there are easements or issues with the property boundaries, that's not considered a marketable title. So the title company goes out and the first thing they do is within a certain period, typically, they'll provide the buyer and the seller with a title commitment. And that typically gets sent to the agent, the listing agent. And I would suggest if it only goes to you that you pass it on to the buyer's agent so they can share with their clients. And they can typically do this within 10 days. If for some reason you think you're going to need more time than that, then you can change that date. There's 4 choices for how this is paid for at closing. 84 through 88. The seller shall deliver to buyer a commitment, which is a title commitment, to issue a current owner's policy of title insurance in the amount of the purchase price, which is called the owner's policy, both at seller's cost. So this means that you're adding to the seller's cost. B, the seller shall deliver a title commitment and issue an owner's policy to be split 50-50. Well, this is not fair to the seller either, in my opinion, because typically the buyer's owner policy is higher than the title commitment, which is usually $150 to $200. And then C, which I think is the most fair, seller shall deliver to buyer a title commitment. In other words, the seller's paying for the search and the commitment. And then the buyer pays for his own owner's policy, which is just determined by the title company. And then D, buyer may order a title commitment to issue an owner's policy, all at buyer's cost. Now, if you're trying to make your offer stronger, this would be the way to do it. And it's a competitive market. It's not a bad idea. You're not adding thousands of dollars of cost, but you're taking some of the seller's cost away, and it might be, something that tips you over the edge in favor of your contract or your offer. On line 89, the title commitment owner's policy shall be issued by, and this should be the title company that you chose on the first page. I want you to remember that the title company is selected by the buyer. Now, there are some agents who say that the transaction shall be closed at blank title company. I understand this if it's new construction, especially because they have almost all their accounts there. So that makes sense. Other than that, though, the buyer really can choose to close wherever they want to. I've seen recently that some agents put in there, the seller will close at blank, and if you choose to close it at a different title company, there may be additional cost, which is correct. But the buyer still gets to choose. On 90, this is one that shocks people sometimes, but the buyer at its sole option, expense, and liability may also obtain a survey of the property to confirm its legal description and determine if there are any defects, encroachments, overlaps, boundary line, or acreage discrepancies, or other adverse matters that may be disclosed. On 95, it says the buyer has 20 days, if none stated, to review this title commitment, and on 101, or on 95 still, that's not enough time to get a survey. Unless there's a survey available, you're going to have to allow probably the full term of the contract. Surveyors are pretty busy. This is a time-consuming process. And so allow plenty of time if you're going to have to get a survey on a property. I can tell you it was common to get surveys before the year 2000, even on residential lots, but it's just stopped. I would guess that there are a lot of errors out there that aren't being caught because there's no surveys being done. If there is a survey done, and let's say we're selling small acreage, it's 10 acres more or less, and the survey determines that you're actually buying 8 acres. This then allows you to review the survey, determine that you're getting less acreage than what was being sold, contact the seller and say, you've got 7 days to correct this. If the seller doesn't choose to correct any issues with the survey or the title, then the buyer can terminate the contract. If they have purchased a survey, then that responsibility becomes the seller's to pay for that survey. If you'll look at line 106, it says if the contract is terminated under this section, then the earnest money is to be refunded to buyer, subject to paragraph 8. If any defect objected to causes a failure of marketable title, then seller shall be liable for any survey and title charges. So even though the buyer initially ordered the survey, paid for the survey, if it fails to close because of the seller's failure to correct title issues, then the responsibility or liability for the survey goes back to the seller. All right, we're going to page 3. Paragraph 7, inspections, A through F here. Generally, the house or property, residential property, farm, whatever it might be, is being sold in its present condition with no warranties expressed or implied, except as may be given to the buyer in writing. But basically what this says is, look, you're buying it as is at this point. And so you need to take that into account when you're making your offer. Well, that made a lot of sense when there's a more competitive market. Currently, what we've got is a market where we're seeing 97 to 100% offers, list to sell prices. So you want to know this, but at the same time, understand that you may have to improve your offer to purchase a property right now. One of the things I always suggest to agents, though, is that if you see something on a house, for example, you're walking around a house and it has chipped paint on the fascia or soffit or on the windows, my suggestion is write that into the offer. Put in the special agreements. Seller to scrape and paint with a like kind paint any chipped paint on the exterior of the home. Write that in the offer. If you see a broken window, seller to replace window in bedroom number 3 that is broken. But do all of this up front, has nothing to do with the inspection. These are changes that you want made so that your buyer is satisfied with buying that property. Now, then we get the inspection. I want you to notice also that the buyer can do any inspections they want. They can use any appraiser they want, and the buyer determines who's qualified. So you need to understand that if the buyer says, I'm going to do my own inspection, that's acceptable. But if he provides an inspection report, it must be in writing. So even if it's on a roll towel, if you can find any, then he could write that on that. Most of the inspectors we use are going to provide a 40 to 60 to 70 page report, but an individual, a contractor, or a buyer may do their own inspections if the buyer so chooses. On line 124 on property data, this has been referred to by some agents as the buyer remorse paragraph, because if you leave that in there, it says within blank days, 5 unstated, after the effective date, which is called the property data review period, buyer may review additional data regarding the property, including but not limited to zoning regulations, subdivision indentures, covenants, declarations and restrictions, association bylaws, rules and regulations, financial information of the subdivision property is a part of, taxes, school district, square footage of land or improvements, and the presence of registered sex offenders or other convicted criminals in the area. If unsatisfied with any property data, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering notice thereof to seller prior to the expiration of the property data review period. You can use the form that's or you can also use an email. Here's the problem with that. You really don't have to have any really solid reason for canceling during the property data period. You could have a solid reason. You could have discovered that the square footage was off, that the rules and regulations of the subdivision don't fit. You could have found the presence of registered sex offenders. But more times than not, what we're finding is that these are, maybe somebody wakes up with a headache, or they bring their mother-in-law over and their mother-in-law doesn't like the house or the neighborhood, and then they can cancel. Most agents, if you don't want to give the full 5 days when you're writing the contract, will put 0 in there. However, if you're protecting your buyer and your buyer says this is important to me, then you would put 5, but you could put more. But it does, in most cases, I think, weaken your contract a little bit, your offer, because you could terminate the contract for no reason. On C, on inspection reports, buyer may, at buyer's own option expense, obtain written inspection reports of the condition of the property as reasonably deemed necessary by the buyer or its lender. And you can do, it gives a long list there, but you can do any inspection you want to, the buyer can. Please note that in this contract, that if you're going to inspect the septic, then you may want to use a rider that's available in the GSBOR documents to have the seller uncover the septic. It makes a lot more sense than have the buyer bring a backhoe out there and try to dig up the yard. The seller typically knows generally where it is, and I would suggest to you, if you don't put it in the special agreements, that you use that rider or amendment to the contract that specifically states that the seller is going to do it. On 139, the inspection notice, buyer must furnish a complete copy of the relevant written inspection report to seller, along with a written list of any unacceptable conditions noted therein, the inspection notice, within a specific number of days. I would suggest it's never shorter than 15. Because if you have a septic and a well, you've got to get both the septic inspected and the well inspected, and you get 1 inspection notice. You don't get 3. And if you have possible roof issues, you've got to get a roofer to evaluate the house. That's a responsibility of the buyer. All inspections are. Then you're going to have time to do that. Now, you can ask for an additional 5 days. You can use a specific document for that, or you can just put it in writing, and the seller automatically has to grant at least that 5 days. Now, the key to this is, once you get an inspection, I'm suggesting this to you as the buyer's agent, I send mine immediately to the listing agent so he can see it. Even before, at the same time the buyer's reviewing it, and I'm reviewing it, I want it in the listing agent's hands so they can review it and send it on to their client. It helps because then when you ask for 5, 10 items, but there's 30 items on the inspection, you know, that probably could be dealt with, they can see that you're being reasonable and they know exactly what you're dealing with. So if the inspector says the roof is shot, there's water running into the home, then it's no question when you say seller to replace the roof, or seller to repair the roof, or seller to repair or replace the roof prior to closing. If they've got the inspection notice and they can see it. If they say there's mold in the crawl space or mildew, and there's a color picture of mildew, then it makes it easier for you to ask for that when you're dealing with the seller. It notes in bold here on line 146, buyer may submit only one inspection notice. It must include all matters unacceptable to buyer and a copy of all relevant inspection report or specialist reports. There was a couple of different companies in towns that used to send over like page 32 of the inspection report. I mean, since it's digital most of the time now, I encourage you always to send a complete report, which is exactly what it says here on line 139. Buyer must furnish a complete copy of the written inspection report. Buyer may not object to anything that is not in an inspection report or a specialist report. That all sounds good, but it kind of changes the game too, because the inspectors are covering themselves also, and so they're putting everything in there. You know, that the closet latch is not latching properly, and that the floor squeaks when they walk through the living room, and on and on and on. And so now what this basically says is on an inspection notice, you can write any item that is on that inspection report. The key as a buyer's agent is do not be late with the inspection notice. If you've got 15 days and that's all you've got, you better get it in within the 15 days, because at 12:01 the next morning, then really the buyer is responsible for any repairs. And you're buying the house in the as-is condition, and the buyer can't cancel at that point. The next section on resolution period, well, let me skip back, I'm sorry. On line 149, if an inspection notice is timely given, in other words, you got it in with the time frame, it shall state, number one, if the buyer is satisfied with all the inspections. Rarely happens, but it can. 2, there are unacceptable conditions to be satisfied by the seller prior to the closing date. Or buyer elects to terminate the contract with earnest money returned to buyer subject to paragraph 8, excepting only as follows. So if you don't check the box on line 154, which where the buyer waives its right to unilaterally terminate the contract, then you can cancel. You could just have an inspection, look at the report, send it to the other agent and say, we're terminating the contract. I typically, if I receive one that is not checked on 154, then I encourage my seller to counter that and say that lines 154 through 156 of the contract regarding limitation of inspection rights to be included as part of this contract. The reason being is I believe that if a buyer wants to buy and a seller wants to sell, then the seller ought to have the opportunity to make repairs as requested by the buyer. Now, the resolution period takes care of the rest of that. Typically, this is 10 days. So you provide an inspection notice with a list of 10 items that you want repaired or replaced. The listing agent delivers that to the seller. The seller reviews that, and then they can accept it as written. They can actually counter that and say, no, we're just going to do this. And the buyer still has time, all of this within 10 days, to come to an agreement to resolve their issues or differences, resolution period. So I would suggest that, you know, you write a clean, clear inspection notice for your clients. And I always tell my sellers when they get the inspection notice, unless there's something crazy on there, do you want to sell the home? And if they say yes, I say, then let's fix it. So we just fix the items. Now, that may not be the way you do it. You may feel like you have to negotiate as a buyer's agent. You've got to do this. And if you're representing the seller, you've always got to negotiate. It's not your job. I mean, the buyer determines what goes in the inspection notice with some guidance from you. and the seller determines what they're willing to fix or repair. That's not your job as an agent. So try to stay out of the middle of that and let them decide. They can make monetary adjustments, but remember that if there are monetary adjustments made, it could affect the buyer's loan. So again, if somebody says, I'll just pay $5,000 in lieu of all repairs, that's fine unless it's a government loan and the government says, no, you've got to have these things fixed prior to closing. So make sure you talk to the lender on those. On 165 through 178, we've got the municipal government inspections. Fortunately, in our market area, we really don't have those. You're going to run into it occasionally. I think in Nixa, if it's a vacant multifamily property, sometimes they do re-inspect, but we don't see it very often in our area, so you don't have to deal with that one. Page 4. The broker roll. This is line 179. The buyer and all involved real estate licensees, including the broker assisting the buyer and seller and their respective licensees identified, may be present during any inspection of the property and walkthrough, but only to assist in the coordination of and compliance with the terms in the contract, and not in any way be interpreted as providing brokers with special knowledge or understanding of any inspection results. Excuse me. The key is stay out of the middle of it. You're not an expert. That's why you hire a third party to do the inspection. It's why you hire a third party to make the repairs in most cases. And then my suggestion, if you've asked for inspection items, the sellers agree to those inspection items, I suggest that then the buyer gets a re-inspection when those items are complete to ensure that they're completed to the satisfaction of the inspector, because they don't have to be completed to the satisfaction of the buyer, really, because the inspector was the one who noted them. So if the inspector says it's okay, then you should be able to continue to closing. And then look at 191. Generally, I mean, all of this on broker, on G, all the way through line 198, they're just saying we're immune from liability as long as we don't hire the individuals ourselves. Now, calling an inspector to set in an appointment for an inspection is not hiring them. That's a totally different deal. We're engaging them to do it, but we're not hiring them. And so we're not responsible for what they say or what they do. So it's basically, this is the lawyer saying, you know, we're protecting you. You're not going to get in trouble, just as long as you don't say that you are the expert or that you go out and hire these people yourself to do these inspections. On line 199 through 206, regarding home warranties, I would just suggest that there's no reason not to ask for a home warranty if there's not one on the property. They're not cheap, $505 now, but at the same time, it typically gives buyers a little comfort. And the sellers also, I always suggest to them that, you know, I know this doesn't make you happy to see that additional $500. However, typically if the air conditioner goes out a week after closing, they're calling me and I'm calling you. So it wouldn't be a bad idea if they called the HSA home warranty or whatever home warranty companies out there. But you need to check one of the boxes. Either the buyer acknowledges seller is not providing one, the seller agrees to pay for one, or 3, the seller has a home warranty plan that'll be transferred. I know that Evan DeShong and Rick Gardner in the Keller Williams Company have almost have a home warranty plan on every property they sell. And they believe that it offers value, and I think it does too. The other thing is, if I know on HSA especially, the seller can get a home warranty plan on their home and it doesn't cost them anything. The home warranty company can even make repairs and it still doesn't cost them anything other than service costs. And they don't have to pay for the home warranty unless the home sells. And then the buyer gets the benefit of the home warranty for the next 12 months. So it makes sense to have one. It's not a reason really not to have one. Now on paragraph 8, disposition of earnest money. Here's the deal. So somebody puts down $1,000 in earnest money on page 1, and then for whatever reason the contract doesn't close. It could be a survey or title issue. It could be that the loan didn't fund or wasn't going to fund. It could be inspection issues that weren't completed. Here's the problem. Once that money goes to a title company or enters into an escrow account, then that money stays there until there is a mutual release signed by both parties. Sometimes if the seller's mad, they won't sign. And sometimes if the buyers are mad, they won't sign, regardless who caused the property not to close on time. Then the money stays in escrow, and then prior to 365 days, whoever's holding that money is required to send that to the state. The state treasurer then keeps it in unclaimed funds and won't release it until they get a notarized letter from both parties to the contract saying, we have come to a decision, we want you to release our money. Well, then guess what? They release it back to the title company. And then what do you have to have? You have to have a mutual release of earnest money signed by both parties again to get it out. Now, the MREC rules say that the broker or the escrow title holder can make a decision on that, but typically they won't do it because they don't want the liability to release it to the wrong person or to the right person, but then being litigation ensuing after that. On 9, this is something you should be aware of, probably with the storms we've had lately, loss and condemnation. Risk of loss to improvements on the property should be borne by the seller until closing. So if a tornado comes through and wipes out the house, or you're buying a farm property, small farm, let's say, with a barn on it, wipes out the barn, those risks are borne by the seller until closing. Now, the buyer can actually receive a check for the amount of the contract for a property. Doesn't typically happen. I know a few years back we had tornadoes in the Battlefield area, and GSBR had houses under contract in there that the buyers simply canceled the contracts. And if they do, it's obviously acceptable. Or you could extend a contract, and then the insurance company and or the sellers can restore the property to the same condition, and then you can close. But if not, then the buyer has the right to cancel that contract without penalty if for some reason it burns down, blows away, drops into a sinkhole, whatever it might be. And again, that was paragraph 9. And now we're heading to paragraph 10. And this will be page 5. This is adjustments and closing costs. Now you can read all this if you want to and memorize it. And then you can have a test later on. However, I will tell you that if you'll just kind of glance over it and then go down to line 286, seller's concessions, notwithstanding the foregoing, it starts, but then it says, all as approved by buyer's lender. In other words, who determines what concessions can be charged? It's the buyer's lender. So you don't get any, as a buyer's agent, you don't get any input into this. As a listing agent, they don't get any input into it. The buyer doesn't get any input into it, and neither does the seller. The lender is going to be the arbiter on this and say, here's what we can take and here's what we will pay for. So, like I said, read, memorize all that if you want to. However, it's going to be the buyer's lender that determines. Now, obviously, we're going to prorate taxes. We're going to prorate HOA dues and things of those items. But other charges that come out of the concessions that are accepted by the seller that the buyer is asking for will be the lender making that determination. The only thing to remember is this doesn't include a home warranty, so that can't be a part of the concessions. It can't be any of the title fees paid by the seller, and it can't be a transaction fee that's charged by the buyer's broker. So in other words, if you see that the MLS commission is 3%, but you charge a buyer admin fee or a buyer's commission, additional $250 on each of your transactions, and the buyer has agreed to that, it can't come out of seller's concessions. And for a while, when these contracts first started changing, the lender was allowing that. And now the contract says clearly you can't do that. If the buyer agrees to a buyer's commission or buyer's admin fee of $250, then those are the buyer's costs. It's not the responsibility of the seller. Binding effect, assignability, and Section 1031 exchange. Here's the deal. Any document that becomes a part of the contract has been signed or initialed. Now, the attorneys say it's the documents, you know, within the four corners of the contract, and maybe counting government riders and things like that. But I can tell you this, if you ever go to litigation, they want everything. So the binding part of the contract is just that. It's a binding contract, so all of it becomes binding. So if the seller agrees to something or the buyer agrees to something, it's binding contract, and then it's binding under all laws, federal, state, and local. As far as assignability, we can assign any contract, and the seller cannot unreasonably withhold that assignment. So I'm buying a property and I'm working for Jack Henry and I get transferred to North Dakota. And I say, holy cow, you know, I call my lender and I call the agent and say, look, I'm getting transferred. The lender has to tell you that, unfortunately, that's not, that doesn't help you get out of the contract. The seller could let you out, but they don't have to. So you find the guy in the next cubicle at Jack Henry and you tell him your problem. He says, hey, I'll buy that house. It's simple as a contract amendment that just says all parties agree that the buyers on this transaction will be blank, whoever you're assigning it to, and then all parties sign it, including the new buyer. And then as far as 1031 exchange, we used to have separate documents for this, or we have to create the language for it as agents. And now it says that the 1031 exchange is allowed by the contract, and each party agrees to cooperate with the other and its intermediary or third party facilitator with such an exchange. Okay, in other words, the language typically with this is that the buyer will participate in a 1031 exchange at no additional cost to the seller. And a 1031 exchange requires different documentation, and the seller has to agree to that, and you have to have a qualified title company or escrow officers that can hold that. So, but it is allowed now under the contract. And then back to 11, now paragraph 12, the entire agreement, this contract and any rider or attached hereto constitutes the entire agreement. Just remember that it's any document. The attorneys would probably say initially that it's just the documents that were signed and initialed by all parties, but I guarantee you they're going to want every page related to the contract, including MLS detail sheets, whether initialed or not. They're going to want that if you ever have litigation. But this contract may not be changed, modified, or amended in whole or in part, except in writing signed by all parties. Now, this is important. We just recently had this happen where an agent modified a contract after her client had signed it. We encourage that agent to seek opportunities elsewhere. You can't do that. And the agent admitted to it, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that is basically fraud, and those are things that you cannot do. So once the contract is set, then it can't be altered by anybody but the parties to the contract, not by the agent. Okay, we're on to paragraph 13, which is page 6. Default remedies. In A and B, basically, you could exchange either one of them because it says if a seller defaults, buyer may. If a buyer defaults, seller may. And there's three things that can happen. Regardless of who defaults, the party that's feels like has caused a default can be caused to specifically enforce the contract and recover damages. In other words, enforce the contract means that you have to sell it or you have to buy it. That's what specific performance means. Or two, if the seller defaults, terminate this contract by notice seller and agree to release seller from any liability upon seller's release of the earnest money and reimbursement to buyer for actual cost. So the buyer is going to have inspection costs, they're going to have loan costs, they may have additional rents. Those are specific costs that you could charge in lieu of going to court. Or three, my favorite, pursue any other remedy and damages available at law or in equity. In other words, I'm coming after you and I want everything. Typically, what we try to do is negotiate these so it doesn't happen. But if one party or the other does default, I would suggest that the best thing you can do is try to avoid that. And you should have your seller or your buyer, if they're considering defaulting and not closing, speak to an attorney, a good real estate attorney, not just any attorney. The few times that I've had a buyer that has said that they're considering not closing, I always suggest to them that we close, especially if the seller's already made repairs, if the buyer's qualified, we close, and then I'll put it back on the market and sell it at no additional Keller Williams fees. We may still have to pay 3% to a buyer's agent, but Keller Williams won't charge anything. It'll be less expensive to a buyer to do that than it will be to default and go into litigation. And my hope is that maybe the market's improved a little bit. Now the repairs are done. Maybe we can get an additional 1 or 2% and cover all their costs and get them out of the contract without litigation. So I always suggest that. And if you do have a buyer or a seller that's considering defaulting, call your local broker and we'll discuss it. Number 14 says the prevailing party, if there is litigation, will be allowed court costs and reasonable attorney fees. This is really difficult to enforce. But the buyer, if he's considering default, and the seller, if he's considering default, should remember that, because attorney's fees go up very quickly. You know, $250 an hour for an attorney is about the average, I would say, in this market. Now, paragraph 15 is important because we all, the seller disclosure is voluntary. So they don't have to fill one out. We encourage them to, and they have to fill out anything that's required by statute. Here are your choices. A, buyer confirms that before signing this offer to purchase, buyer received a seller's disclosure statement. The seller's disclosure statement is not a substitute for any inspection buyer may wish to obtain. Buyer is advised to address any concerns buyer may have about information in the seller's disclosure statement by use of contingencies under this contract. So if you see something in the contract you're not sure about, you're saying, once you've read the disclosures, write that into the contract. B, the seller hasn't posted a disclosure, or their lazy agent hasn't posted a disclosure online yet, and you don't have access to one. So the seller agrees to provide buyer with the seller's disclosure statement within 1 day, if unstated, after the effective date. Now the buyer has 3 days to review, and after reviewing it, if they don't like it, guess what? They can terminate the contract without penalty. Now, if your client filled out a disclosure statement and you don't get it loaded into the MLS or provide it to the buyer's agent, then you've got to take responsibility for that one. And that would be a bad conversation to have with your client. Or C, no seller's disclosure statement will be provided by seller. Seller confirms the information in the seller's disclosure statement will be accurate to the best of seller's knowledge. Seller will fully and promptly disclose in writing to buyer any new information pertaining to the property discovered by or made known to the seller at any time prior to closing, and constitutes an adverse material fact or would make any existing information set forth in the seller's disclosure statement false, material, misleading. If you had a limb fall on your house and you're going to have your roof replaced, it needs to be disclosed. And so if you're in the middle of a contract, under contract, then that information needs to go to the buyer's agent immediately, and what remedies are going to be taken. But also, you have an inspection, you provide an inspection notice, you can't come to an agreement, the parties agree to terminate the contract without penalty. Those items that were disclosed during the inspection, if they're material to the property, have to be disclosed. Now, your seller can refuse to do it, but you as an agent have a responsibility. The basic of this is if you know it, then everybody else knows it. So if something changed, so you have an inspection, there's water in the crawl space and evidence of mildew, and then the contract terminates because of this, and the seller says, I'm not going to repair that, you have a responsibility to the public and to all the agents to make sure that that is disclosed. So if a client or an agent calls you about it, you have to say, listen, we had an inspection. Here's what was discovered. I don't know if it still exists. I just want to make you aware of that. Lead-based paint disclosure is required by law, so make sure you have that. You can do a walkthrough. It's the best to do a walkthrough with the house vacant. That's not always possible when we're trying to move back to back. Sometimes we don't get to see the house completely empty. The key is, though, especially unless there's something obvious that occurs, you walk in, there's a big burn hole in the middle of the floor or the roof's leaking on your head, is to make sure that the repairs that were requested were done. And again, I suggest to you that your buyer should have it re-inspection by the same inspector. Signatures, this contract may be executed in multiple counterparts, each of which shall be deemed an original, but all of which shall constitute one and the same instrument. For purposes of executing or amending this contract or delivering a notice, an approved standard form or other written document which is signed and transmitted by any electronic method is deemed valid in accordance with the Missouri Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, but not limited to by facsimile, which is a fax machine, digital signature, or scanned image, such as a PDF via email, is to be treated as an original. So in other words, you get it signed electronically, you bring it back to the office, you print it out, and then you scan it and send it, it's still considered to be the original signature. And then this is just legal stuff in paragraph 19, which says that a seller, when it says seller in the contract, or whether it says buyer, that could be multiple people. On a lot of times in these inherited properties, we'll have 10 parties on a contract on the seller side alone because they have kids and spouses now. And then notices, bottom line, we can read the paragraph totally, but put everything in writing. So any notice, consent, approval, request, waiver, objection, or other communication collectively called a notice required under this contract to be delivered to seller shall be in writing and shall be deemed delivered to seller upon delivery thereof to the broker, assisting the seller whether as a limited agent, designated agent, dual agent, or transaction broker. In other words, upon delivery, you've received notice. Upon delivery. So if you get an inspection notice signed on the 15th day, and then you decide to go to bed early, and then on day 16, you send it, the notice has not been delivered in a timely manner, and it won't be accepted. So it's delivery, and again, the other opposite would be you deliver that notice at 11:59 on the 15th day, but the seller's agent doesn't see it until the 16th day. It was delivered, and you have a record of it, so you're okay in that situation. And the same thing it says, likewise, any notice delivered by the buyer should be treated the same way. The key to it is that it's delivery. So if I scan this as a PDF and I put it in an email and I push that button and it says send, and then I can look and see that it's sent, that's considered delivery to the other person. And then there are riders that we use, and again, from page 1 or page 2, when we talk about financing, the most common rider you're going to use is number 379, or in line 379, the government loan rider, MSC 2011R. And if you've got a government loan, then you must use this. You can't choose not to. You won't use a backup contract rider very often, but occasionally we still use contingency for sale of buyer's existing property or contingency for closing of buyer's property. Now, there's a difference between these. Contingency for sale means I'm writing this offer and it's contingent on selling this, which is not under contract. That typically will have a kick-out clause. And it'll say, if it's accepted by the seller, it'll say active under contingency. The second one, though, is a contingency for closing of buyer's existing property. In other words, I've got my buyer's house under contract, and now we're writing an offer on your house. And that should show pending in the MLS. And then if you have to create some document, a Word document that says whatever it might say, and typically there's a rider or an amendment for that, but let's just say you have to create a list of items from a shop or something that must remain with the home. Then you could do that in the boxes marked other. Or on 22, paragraph 22, lines 390 through 393. This is where you would write in anything that you're asking for that's not included in the contract. And this would go back all the way to the first page to be specific about, remove the storage, the red storage shed in the backyard prior to closing. You could rewrite that. Or you could also put contingencies right here under special agreements. This offer is contingent upon the buyer signing a contract with Springfield Public Schools no later than May 10th. Now, if you look at 385 through 88, this contract's not designed for use with new construction. Some of the builders have their own contracts, but you might want to enter initially into a contract on a MS or an Missouri Realtors form, and then, enter into a contract with the builder separately. Because when you're doing new construction, there's about 2,000 items that have to be addressed, from roof color to exterior materials to light fixtures and on and on and on. Typically, a good builder has that list prepared and you can make choices. That's what you should do. So if you're writing a contract on new construction, you want to ask that agent, when can we meet with the builder, or when can we sit down and make all of our choices and get them in writing and have them signed by the buyer and agreed to by the builder / seller. On 394, licensee personal interest disclosure. My wife and I are buying a house here in the next week or two. We've got it under contract. But then we would say that me, James L. Boland, is a real estate broker or salesperson and is a party to this transaction. And I am a principal and/or I have a direct ownership interest in the seller or the buyer, or an immediate family member, which is what I am in this one. I think the last contract we wrote, I was the buyer and she was the agent. Maybe the one before that, she was the buyer and I was the agent. And we just did that from simplicity's sake, working with dot loop and having to deal with email issues. But if you are a party to the transaction, how far out does this go? Or if it's a family member, I sold my niece a home a couple of years ago, and I made sure that I marked in there that I was an immediate family member to the buyer and that I was Uncle Jim. So, sources of broker compensation. You're typically, as a buyer's agent, you're getting compensated by the seller. Now you need to check and make sure it's provided for in the MLS and what that amount is. You kind of need to know that number. But then also, if you're charging a buyer fee, which is not uncommon in the market anymore, then you need to mark also that the buyer is paying you a compensation also. And then below on paragraph 25, what is your relationship? The licensee is assisting buyer. If you're working at Keller Williams and you're assisting the buyer, you're probably a buyer's limited agent, but you're also on 416 a designated agent. Now that's included in the exclusive right to sell agreement, where the buyer, exclusive right to purchase agreement, where you are becoming a buyer's agent, a designated agent for that buyer. The licensee assisting the seller, depending on which company it is, they may or may not be designated agents also. So sometimes you have to let those guys fill that out themselves. Now, if you're at an open house as a listing agent, and it's your listing, and a buyer walks in and says, I want to buy it, and you say, well, you understand I'm working for the seller, and they say, that's fine. And you fill out all the documents, you get to page 7 here on the contract, the licensee assisting the seller, the listing agent will be a seller's limited agent and designated agent, and then on the buyer's side, you're assisting the buyer, but you're still a seller's limited agent. Okay? A lot of people get that confused. They think because they're working with a buyer, they're automatically a buyer's agent. But agency is a lot deeper than that. So you just don't become a buyer's agent or have a fiduciary responsibility because you meet somebody at an open house. Then it asks for the broker's firm name, in this case, Keller Williams Realty, Keller Williams, Greater Springfield Realty, LLC, the broker's firm state license number, which is on every listing, every Keller Williams listing, signature of the agent, licensee's printed name, and then the licensee state license number. So if you're new to the business, you probably want to put those on your notepad or whatever you call it in your phone, because those are required for compliance, and they're required by MREC. Page 8, franchise disclosure. This is included in both the exclusive right to purchase and the exclusive right to sell. It just says that the franchise or is not responsible for the acts of said broker. Now, when it says broker, it's talking about the brokerage, but I will remind you of this one thing. The broker, the designated broker for the company, is ultimately responsible for your acts. So make sure you are a good actor. And then sales information, unless we're told otherwise, we're going to provide this information to the MLS, to the local board of realtors, so they can distribute it. And that helps set value in the market and help determine market value. Excuse me. 28 and 29, you read that if you want to. That's the title company's job and is not our job. We're not going to ask anybody if they're a terrorist. I'm not going to. You can if you want to. And then if it is a foreign person, again, I always direct all those questions when an agent asks me to the title company. I think they are the arbiter in that situation. And then on line 45 on acceptance deadline date on an offer, if, in this market, you try to make it as short as you can for the seller to make a determination. If you're making a good, strong offer, you want an answer to it, and you may still lose out. Or they may counter you and say, we're accepting highest and best, because the prices have exceeded what I think is totally sensible at this time. They're a little bit crazy, but you may have to offer full price, and you may have to accept the fact that you may not get the property even if you offer full price, but your deadline should not be very long. And especially, here's kind of the ground rules on that. If the seller has to leave the house so that you can show it, then you can shorten that time frame. So if I was writing an offer today at 4 o'clock, I'd probably put it, 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. If I could get it all signed and together and over to the other agent tonight, I'd probably put it, 10, and I probably wouldn't put it any later than noon tomorrow. Now, if it's a foreclosure property or a vacant property, you need to just discuss with the agent, where are the sellers? How hard are they to get to? How long should I leave this thing out here? If foreclosure, you might as well just leave it blank, because you're not going to get a response from the asset managers for weeks. And time is of the essence. They state this in the contract because there are a lot of timelines that have to be followed within the contract. Your client as a buyer's agent needs to be aware of this. So if they write earnest money and they've got to deliver a check, time is of the essence. If they're getting a loan, time is of the essence in making all those applications. If they're getting an appraisal, it's really their responsibility, even though the lender kind of guides them on that. If they're getting inspections, time is of the essence. If they're going to respond and provide an inspection notice, time is of the essence. So make sure that these timelines are followed. This is the responsibility of your client, but you have to guide them. You deal with contracts every day, they don't. So make sure they stay on top of this. And then on 454, check box if additional signatures are needed and attach additional signature page. And again, I told you we're with the baby boomers dying away, a lot of times houses are inherited by multiple parties. And so if the son inherits it and he's married, then the wife's got to be on there and so on. So we could have 10 signatures on a page, and now they've provided us with that form. And then buyer signs it and dates it, print their name underneath, and it says if signing on behalf of her trust or other legal entity, please print its name and your title below. So I have a legal entity called Kelby Lane Incorporated. So I would put that there if I was buying it under that name, and my title would be president. Then there's the first 8 pages of the contract. Now you have additional documents that have to be sent to the buyer's agent. Certainly if you've got the pre-approval letter or approval letter from your client, you should send those. You should send signed disclosures back. It's a suggestion from us that you should send the MLS detail sheet with their buyer's initials on it, so we all know we're on the same page. If you have any questions regarding contracts, you can call myself or Don Klepper, and we'll take care of it. But you can also talk to veteran agents. A lot of them, if you just want some simple questions answered, then you can receive guidance for them. I think we're done.
Thanks, Jim.